History often tells us that countries are protected by armies, by soldiers, by weapons, by fortresses. But sometimes, the greatest defense a country possesses is something no army can easily defeat: distance. There is a country where an invading army can cross the border and still be hundreds of miles away from its real objective. A country where the battlefield seems to grow larger with every step an army takes. This is Russia. For centuries, powerful armies have entered Russian territory with enormous ambitions. They came with experienced soldiers, powerful weapons, and carefully prepared plans. But Russia presented a different kind of problem. It was not simply a country that an army could invade. It was a country that an army had to survive. Russia stretches across enormous distances, from the borders of Europe deep into Asia. And for an invading army, that size creates a problem that begins long before the final battle: distance. An army does not move through a country by itself. It needs food, it needs ammunition, it needs fuel, medical supplies, equipment, and reinforcements, and everything an army needs must somehow follow it. At first, an invading force may appear unstoppable. The soldiers advance, battles are won, the enemy retreats. But with every mile forward, the distance between the army and its homeland becomes greater. Supply lines become longer, roads become more important, and the army becomes increasingly dependent on a system stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. This is where Russia's geography becomes something more than a map. It becomes a weapon of time. An army may defeat its opponent in battle, it may capture a city, it may even reach the heart of the country. But the farther it advances, the more difficult it becomes to keep thousands of soldiers supplied. Russia does not always need to destroy an invading army in one decisive moment. Sometimes, it only needs to make the invasion last, long enough for supplies to become scarce, long enough for soldiers to become exhausted, and long enough for an army that once seemed unstoppable to begin fighting against the country itself. This is the first great challenge of invading Russia. The land is simply too vast to conquer quickly, and when an army cannot win quickly, time begins to work against it. History would demonstrate this again and again. The Swedish Empire would march deep into Russian territory. Napoleon would lead one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen toward Moscow. And more than a century later, Nazi Germany would launch an enormous invasion across the Soviet Union. Different armies, different centuries, different weapons, but the same fundamental problem. The farther they went, the more Russia demanded from them. Because in Russia, reaching the battlefield is only the beginning. The real question is whether an army can survive the distance between where it begins and where it hopes to win. For an invading army, distance is not simply a number on a map. It is a constant demand. Every mile forward creates another mile that must be supplied. Every captured city creates another position that must be defended. And every advance pushes the army farther away from the factories, roads, railways, and reserves that keep it alive. This is the hidden battle of invading a country as large as Russia. Logistics. An army can have thousands of soldiers, it can possess powerful weapons, but without food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, military strength begins to disappear. On a smaller battlefield, supplies may be transported relatively quickly, but in Russia, the distances can become enormous. Roads may be poor. Railways may not reach where an army needs them. Bridges can be destroyed. And the farther an invading force moves, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a reliable connection with its homeland. This creates a dangerous cycle. The army advances. The supply lines stretch. The army needs more protection for those supply lines. More soldiers are required to guard roads, bridges, railways, and transport routes. And the further the army moves, the greater the burden becomes. An invasion can therefore begin with speed and end with exhaustion. This is one reason why Russia's geography has repeatedly created problems for invading armies. The goal is not always to defeat the enemy immediately. It is to survive long enough for the enemy's advantages to become weaknesses. A fast army may move quickly, but speed can also create distance, and distance can create isolation. The further an army advances, the more vulnerable its rear becomes. Its supply routes must travel through territory that may be hostile. Its soldiers must protect the roads behind them, and every delay gives the defender more time to regroup. This was one of the most important lessons learned by armies that entered Russia. The map may show a straight line toward the objective, but armies do not move across maps. They move across real terrain, through real weather, along real roads, and they must carry everything they need to survive. This is why Russia's greatest natural defense may not be one specific feature. It is the combination of everything: distance, terrain, climate, and time. Each problem makes the others worse. A longer journey creates greater logistical demands. Greater logistical demands make an army more vulnerable to delays. Delays expose soldiers to changing weather, and changing weather can make an already difficult supply system even harder to maintain. The result is a battlefield where victory cannot always be measured by how far an army has advanced. Sometimes, the real question is how much strength remains behind that advance, because an army can move deeper into Russia while becoming weaker with every mile. And eventually, the invader faces a decision: continue forward and risk becoming isolated, or turn back across hundreds of miles of territory. For one of the most powerful military commanders in European history, this decision would become a catastrophe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and in 1812, he would discover that conquering Russia was not simply a question of defeating the Russian army. It was a battle against distance itself. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He had conquered or dominated much of continental Europe. His armies were among the most experienced and powerful in the world. And now, Napoleon turned toward Russia. The invasion began with an enormous force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed into Russian territory. On paper, the scale of the operation was overwhelming, but the Russians did something that made Napoleon's greatest advantage far less useful. They retreated. Instead of allowing Napoleon to destroy the Russian army in one decisive battle, Russian forces withdrew deeper into the country. For Napoleon, this created a dangerous situation. His army continued to advance, but the decisive victory he needed remained out of reach. The farther the French army moved, the longer its supply lines became, and the deeper it entered Russian territory, the more difficult it became to maintain the enormous force that had crossed the border. Then, in September 1812, the two armies finally met at Borodino. The battle was one of the bloodiest single-day engagements of the campaign. Napoleon's army gained the battlefield, but the victory did not produce the result he needed. The Russian army was not destroyed, and the war was not over. Napoleon continued toward Moscow. When his army finally entered the city, it appeared that the campaign had reached its objective, but Moscow did not bring Napoleon the peace he expected. The city had been largely abandoned, and negotiations did not produce the surrender he wanted. Napoleon had reached Moscow, but he had not conquered Russia. This was the moment when geography became destiny. His army was now deep inside Russian territory. The campaign had consumed enormous amounts of food and supplies. The weather was becoming colder, and the army still had to return across the same vast distance it had already crossed. The retreat became a disaster. Soldiers struggled against hunger, exhaustion, disease, and freezing conditions. Horses died. Supplies became scarce. The army that had entered Russia as a massive military force was now fighting simply to survive. The Russian campaign had demonstrated a brutal truth. Capturing the enemy's capital does not always mean winning the war. Napoleon had marched deep into Russia. He had reached Moscow, but Russia had not collapsed. Instead, the distance that once seemed like empty space had become a trap. Every mile of advance had created another mile of retreat, and the army that had crossed the border with confidence now had to fight its way back. The campaign of 1812 became one of the greatest military disasters in European history, but it also revealed something important. Russia's defense was not based on one single battle. It was based on the ability to absorb an invasion, to trade space for times, and to force the invader to continue fighting long after the initial victory seemed to have been achieved. Napoleon had not been defeated simply because he could not reach Russia. He had been defeated because reaching Russia was only the beginning. And decades later, another invading army would face an even larger version of the same problem. But this time, the weapons would be modern. The armies would be mechanized, and the scale of the invasion would be almost unimaginable. There is a popular image of Russia's military history. An invading army enters, the Russian winter arrives, and the cold destroys the invader. But the reality is more complicated. Winter did not fight alone. The real danger came from the combination of distance, logistics, exhaustion, and weather. Cold becomes far more dangerous when an army is already starving. Snow becomes far more difficult when roads are already damaged. And freezing temperatures become deadly when soldiers lack adequate clothing, shelter, or supplies. This is what made the Russian climate such a powerful force. It amplified every weakness an invading army already possessed. For soldiers advancing deep into Russian territory, the environment itself could become a constant struggle. Roads became difficult, transportation slowed, animals weakened, equipment failed, and the amount of energy required simply to keep an army moving increased. Meanwhile, the defender had one crucial advantage: time. The Russian strategy of retreat and resistance could force an invader to continue operating far from its original bases. The longer the campaign lasted, the more important the changing seasons became, and eventually, an army that had planned for a short campaign could find itself fighting a completely different war. This was the lesson Napoleon's army learned during its retreat from Moscow. But it would not be the last time an invading force discovered the same reality. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union began with enormous force. German armies advanced rapidly. Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses. And once again, it appeared that a powerful invading army might achieve a decisive victory. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The war continued. And as the German advance moved deeper into Soviet territory, the same problems began to emerge: distance, logistics, resistance, and time. The farther the German armies advanced, the more difficult it became to supply them. The Soviet Union was not simply a battlefield. It was a massive geographic space that had to be crossed, occupied, and supplied. And every mile created another challenge. By the time winter arrived, German forces were already operating under enormous pressure. The cold did not create the entire disaster, but it made existing problems worse. Vehicles struggled, soldiers suffered, supply systems were under immense strain, and the offensive began to lose momentum. The lesson was clear: climate alone does not defeat an army, but when combined with an enormous distance and an overstretched supply system, it can become a devastating force. Russia's environment did not need to destroy an invading army by itself. It only needed to make survival more difficult every day. And that is perhaps the most important point. The natural defenses of Russia work together. The distance creates the logistical problem. The logistical problem creates exhaustion. The exhaustion makes the climate more dangerous. And time allows all of these pressures to accumulate. This is why the Russian winter became legendary. Not because cold weather magically defeated every invader, but because an army already weakened by distance and war could be pushed beyond its limits. And in the 20th century, one of the largest invasions in history would discover exactly how difficult it was to fight a war against a country that refused to collapse. But the problems facing the German army went far beyond the arrival of winter. The Soviet Union was enormous, and once again, the map itself began to change the nature of the war. The German armies advanced deeper, the supply lines stretched farther, the roads became more difficult, and the distance between the front and the original bases of supply continued to grow. At the beginning of the campaign, speed had been one of Germany's greatest advantages. Rapid advances allowed German forces to capture enormous amounts of territory. But speed created a dangerous contradiction. The faster the front moved forward, the faster the supply system had to follow. Fuel had to reach the vehicles, ammunition had to reach the soldiers, food had to reach the armies, and damaged equipment had to be repaired or replaced. Every mile of advance made these tasks more difficult. The German military had planned for a rapid campaign. But the Soviet Union did not surrender. Instead, the war continued, and every week that passed created new problems for the invading army. The German forces had to maintain their advance, while also supplying enormous numbers of soldiers across vast distances. The roads could not always support the movement of modern armies. Railway systems had to be adapted. Bridges had to be repaired. Vehicles were pushed to their limits. And behind the front lines, enormous distances separated the fighting from the bases that supported it. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance continued. The Soviet Union could lose territory and still continue the war. It could retreat and still fight. It could suffer enormous losses and continue mobilizing. But perhaps most importantly, the Soviet state began moving its industrial capacity away from the advancing German armies. Factories were dismantled, machines were loaded onto trains, workers and production facilities were moved eastward, and far from the front, Soviet industry continued producing the weapons needed for the war. The geography of the Soviet Union was giving the defenders something incredibly valuable. Time. Time to reorganize, time to produce weapons, time to train new forces, and time to move the resources of the country beyond the reach of the advancing armies. Then came the struggle for Moscow. The German advance had reached deep into Soviet territory. The capital was now within reach. For the German leadership, capturing Moscow promised a potentially decisive victory. But once again, reaching the objective was not the same as achieving victory. The farther the German army advanced, the more difficult the operation became. The campaign had already lasted far longer than originally expected. The supply system was under increasing pressure, the troops were exhausted, and the Soviet Union was still fighting. The war was turning into something Germany had not planned for. A long war, and a long war changed the balance of power. An army designed for rapid victory could become increasingly vulnerable when the campaign continued without a decisive conclusion. Every day created new demands. Every mile placed greater pressure on the supply system, and every delay gave the defender more time to recover and reorganize. Once again, the same pattern appeared. An invading army could move forward. But moving forward was not the same as winning. The Soviet Union could lose territory and still continue the war. It could retreat and still fight. It could absorb enormous losses and continue mobilizing. The geography of the country created strategic depth, and that depth bought time. Time to reorganize, time to produce weapons, time to bring new forces to the battlefield, and time for the invaders' own logistical problems to become more serious. This does not mean that geography alone defeated Nazi Germany. The Soviet victory came through enormous military sacrifice, industrial mobilizations, strategic decisions, and the resistance of millions of people. But geography shaped the conditions in which that war was fought. Russia's vast distances made a quick victory increasingly difficult, and once the war became a prolonged struggle, the advantages of the invading army began to diminish. The lesson of Napoleon had returned. A powerful army could enter Russia, it could advance, it could win battles, it could capture enormous amounts of territory, but it still had to solve the same fundamental problem. How do you sustain a massive military operation across a country of continental scale? The answer became harder with every mile, and eventually, the invasion itself became a war of endurance. This is what makes Russia different from a country protected by a single natural barrier. There is no one wall, no one mountain, no one river. Instead, there is depth. The country can absorb an attack, it can retreat, it can continue fighting, and it can force the invader to travel farther and fight longer than originally expected. For an invading army, the greatest danger may therefore come not at the beginning of the campaign, but from the fact that the campaign refuses to end. And that brings us to the final question. If Russia's greatest defense is not one fortress, one army, or one mountain range, then what exactly makes the country so difficult to conquer? Russia teaches us one of the most important lessons in military history. Sometimes, a country's greatest defense is not a single weapon. It is not even a single army. Sometimes, it is the space between the invader and victory. Throughout history, powerful armies have entered Russian territory. The Swedish Empire marched east. Napoleon led his grand army toward Moscow. And in the 20th century, Nazi Germany pushed deep into the Soviet Union. The armies were different. The weapons were different. The technology was different. But the fundamental challenge remained. Russia was too large to conquer quickly, and every mile of advance created new problems. Supplies had to travel farther. Soldiers had to endure longer campaigns. Roads and railways had to support enormous military operations. And the farther an army advanced, the more difficult it became to maintain the strength that had carried it there. This was the real power of Russia's geography. It did not have to stop an invading army at the border. It did not have to destroy every enemy in a single battle. Instead, the country could absorb the invasions and force the invader to continue. The army moved forward. the distance increased, the supply lines stretched, and the cost of every additional mile became greater. Then came the environment, the climate, the seasons, the enormous distances. None of these factors acted alone. Together, they created a system of natural resistance. Distance created logistical problems. Logistical problems created exhaustion. Exhaustion made the climate more dangerous, and time allowed every weakness to grow. This was the hidden defense of Russia. An invading army could win a battle and still lose the campaign. It could capture a city and still fail to conquer the country. It could reach Moscow and still have no path to victory. Because occupying territory is one thing. Maintaining an army across thousands of miles of territory is another. And this is where Russia's geography becomes so powerful. The country can trade space for time. It can retreat without immediately surrendering. It can continue fighting while an invading army moves deeper into its territory. And every mile the invader travels creates another problem that must eventually be solved. The army must be supplied. The roads must remain open. The equipment must continue functioning. The soldiers must remain strong enough to fight. And the connection between the front and the homeland must survive. If that connection begins to fail, the entire invasion begins to weaken. Russia was never impossible to invade. History proves that. Armies crossed its borders. Cities were captured. Territory was occupied. But the deeper question was always the same. Could the invader continue? Could it keep its soldiers supplied? Could it maintain its strength? Could it survive long enough to turn military victories into lasting control? Again and again, Russia demonstrated the power of strategic depth. The country could retreat without immediately surrendering. It could trade territory for time. And it could force an invading army to continue fighting long after its original plans had begun to collapse. That may be the greatest lesson of Russia. Sometimes, the strongest defense a country can have is not a wall around its borders. It is the distance beyond them. A distance that forces every invading army to spend more time, more resources, and more strength, just to keep moving forward. The land itself becomes part of the war, and eventually, the invader may discover that the greatest enemy is no longer the army standing in front of it. It is the road behind it, the supplies that cannot arrive, the distance that cannot be shortened, and the time that can no longer be recovered. This is why Russia's greatest defense is not one fortress, not one mountain, not one river, and not even one army. It is the combination of everything: the size of the country, the depth of its territory, the difficulty of its roads, the demands of its climate, the resilience of its people, and above all, time. An invading army may enter Russia with enormous strength, but the longer it remains there, the more it must spend. More fuel, more ammunition, more food, more manpower, more time, and eventually, more of everything it cannot replace. That is the paradox of invading Russia. The invader may believe that every step forward brings it closer to victory, but sometimes, every step forward also takes it farther away from the ability to win. The battlefield grows, the supply lines stretch, the campaign becomes longer, and the army that once appeared unstoppable slowly becomes trapped by the distance it has traveled. So, what do you think makes a country truly difficult to conquer? Is it mountains, jungles, deserts, oceans? Or is it something less visible, the ability of a country to use its geography to turn an invading army's greatest strength into its greatest weakness? Let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mythic Wildlife for more cinematic documentaries exploring the world's most extraordinary places and the incredible stories hidden within them. In the next episode, we're heading to another country where geography has shaped the fate of invading armies for centuries. I'm Ask Studio. Thank you for joining me on this journey from Mythic Wildlife. Until next time, may the power of nature be with you. Stay curious, and remember,